Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Is It Fascist? Today we're going to be taking a look at the Old Republic from Star Wars. This is kind of a follow up to The New Order, which got a perfect 12 out of 12. So far, the only episode in the series where we looked at an ideology organization that scored that high. So we'll see how it stacks up to its predecessor. I think this is a very good comparison because the two institutions slash ideologies represent extremely different worldviews and structures. They're also from the same universe, and one is a direct successor to the other. So there's a lot of good comparisons to be made here. Also, as always, I do not rig these. The closest I come to rigging these is at the end. If there's a half a point that'll put it in one category or another, I'll kind of round it up or down based on where I think, what I think it's more similar to. And I will, at the start of these, kind of go through, come up with examples and how I'm going to evaluate it. But the actual number that comes out is just based on an honest count of how many things the particular institution or ideology ticks off. So that being said, let's get into it. The Old Republic was started by the core worlds, the most populated, wealthy, and industrialized worlds in the galaxy, and eventually came to include the Mid-Rim and Outer Rim as various colony ships went out from it. While it was initially, and to a certain extent, continued to be dominated by humans, in a lot of the colony worlds, you had near-human species evolve based on their specific climate. Like you had the Chiss, you had, I think Twi'leks count as near humans, the Miralukins, among many others. So they were members of the Republic. You also increasingly got non-human related, like Nemoidians, what are they called again? Geonosians and Kamasi, and a number of other Bothans, non-human related species, joined the Republic, and eventually it came to encompass most of the eastern half of the galaxy, most of the northern half as well. Once you start getting into the south and particularly western half of the galaxy, which is commonly referred to as the unknown regions, it becomes a lot harder because the phase lanes are more unstable. There's a variety of savage peoples who live there. You also just... There's a lot of reasons why the western half of the galaxy is so difficult and was never really colonized. But the rest of the eastern half, I think, largely belongs to the Republic. You've had periods where it's lost a lot of it to various Sith empires. I don't entirely understand how Hutt space works. I'm not sure if it's nominally part of the Republic and just completely autonomous, or it's just not part of the Republic at all. But that's neither here nor there. The Old Republic was generally accepted as being the sole galactic government. Even nations and peoples who were not formally part of the Republic did acknowledge that, as far as galactic governments were concerned, it was really the only game in town. And various successor states, be it the Empire, the New Republic, the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances, Darth Krayt's Sith Empire, and the Fel Empire, would all, to a certain extent, claim the mantle of sole galactic government, if not as the direct successor and inheriting the claim of the Old Republic, then as kind of a successor in the sense that there has to be a galactic government, and this is a legitimizing idea. So we're going to be looking at the Old Republic in both the post and pre-Rusin formulations. I'm going to kind of be doing an average of the two, as they are, for probably the purposes of this scale, fairly similar. We are not going to include the Republic under Palpatine or during the Clone Wars, because that will dramatically increase the score of this, making it resemble the New Order more, as Palpatine transformed the Republic into the New Order. So if we get to a state where the Old Republic, pre and post Rusin, contradict each other, we'll just try to figure that out. So let's get to the scale. Number one, an ideologically syncretic mixture of reactionary, conservative, and revolutionary slash progressive ideas. I think one of the ironies about the old republic, and this is something you particularly see with a lot of people who identify as alt right or right wing or NRX or that sort of thing, is a lot of people hate the old republic and view it as this liberal institution that imposed democracy and was oppressive, and they'll draw comparisons between it and the global American empire and the UN. I would tend to disagree. I think it's a lot more similar to, if not very early America, the kind of society that a lot of paleo conservatives and paleo libertarians would want, where it's extremely decentralized. The central government has very little power other than regulating interstate commerce, pre-Rusin having a military, dealing with foreign affairs, and some rather extreme cases of warfare between members. But beyond that, it doesn't really do a lot. If you look at the various member states, you had liberal democracies, you had absolute monarchies, you had elective monarchies, you had hive worlds that used completely alien, pun intended, forms of governance. You had corporate states like the Nemoidians and the banking clans and numerous others that were governed, were states that were functioned as corporations. And all of these various states were able to exist within the old republic, seemingly without any real issue. I can't really recall there being many cases where the old republic attempted to impose regimes. I think there was some of that when they post Rusin, when they were trying to deal with the Jedi Lord problem, or well, not necessarily a problem, but tried to deal with that. And if there was a genocide or interplanetary war or pirates or slavers, they would try to deal with that. But by and large, they just let the various states do what they want. They were able to maintain their own immigration, economic policies, and that sort of thing. So I would argue it's not really progressive or revolutionary. If anything, it's a deeply conservative institution that's very resistant to change. That was one of the issues that Palpatine brought up, was that the Republic was incapable of dealing with the separatist threat because it was so conservative, so deliberate, and so slow. Which, once again, I think it bears much more of a resemblance to the paleo-conservative vision of a decentralized localist government than anything you would really see in a fascist regime or the global American empire. So I would say it's broadly speaking a conservative. You could argue maybe kind of a liberal conservative, if you understand what that term means. I'd say no, though. I'd say it's not a syncretic form of government at all. Identitarianism with a clearly defined in-group and out-group. Once again, I would say definitively no. Well, you can make a case that particularly near the end, humans were the dominant group within the Old Republic, and you had human high culture, you had a core world snobbery towards the other planets and other peoples within the galaxy. There really was not much in the way of identitarianism. I guess there was like within the Republic and outside of the Republic, but that is a massive, massive stretch. Like I said, there was a plurality of religions, cultures, ethnic groups, and completely different races that existed within the Republic. And they were largely left alone by the central government. So we're going to have to say a definitive no here. Third, a revanchist or romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or avenge itself against a historical foe. So this is going to be the first point that we're going to give it. The Republic would wax and wane throughout its history. There were time periods where it was dominant and flourishing and prosperous, and there were time periods where it basically collapsed. During the Galactic Cold War and I think it's the Great Galactic War, the Republic got completely and utterly blown out by the Sith Empire. And you did have a variety of revanchist movements who wanted to kind of continue the the war and restart it. You had that against Revan's Sith Empire. Probably the best example is during the New Sith Wars, where the Republic completely collapsed, and you had a series of Jedi chancellors who were trying to restore it. Even post Rusin, you had, and you can see this pre Palpatine, a romantic desire to go back to when the Republic had an army, when it was a bit more powerful, and restore it to its former glory. Nostalgia is something that's ever present, and the longer a state goes on, oftentimes the more nostalgic it becomes. So I would say that there was a deep nostalgia in periodically during the Old Republic, but I think there was enough of it to give it a point here. A belief in the supremacy of the party or state? No, I don't think I really need to go into too much detail about that. Maybe some of a lot of the constituent parts probably had some variant of this, but given that it imposed virtually no restrictions on its various members, aside from, like I said, interstate commerce, interstate war, and stuff like that, I really don't think there was any aspect of this. A conception of idealized new man. Once again, in no way does it like vaguely resemble this concept. Every society was able to define their own conception of a man. The only time you really see you do see aspects like patriotism towards the republic and just kind of normal moral values you'd see in most civilizations, but nothing particularly radical or kind of weird. Okay. A nationalist foreign policy combined with an amoral, zero-sum, or realist conception of international affairs. I mean, the issue is it contained most of the galaxy, so the concept of foreign policy is kind of hard to grasp. You could argue maybe against the Sith empires, but the Sith empires tended to be the aggressor, and you could view the Republic as mostly just acting in defense of its borders and its people against a foreign enemy. So I would say no, this would not really apply. Internally, it seemed like it was more ideologically predisposed towards, once again, just decentralization. I think it would periodically intervene if there was, like I said, interstate warfare. But I think it was more, I don't know if you want to say conservative or liberal internationalist, but very decentralized. I would not say it would fit into this category. An indifference to or marginalization of economics. I would actually disagree with this, as one of the primary purposes of the Old Republic was to manage, like I said, interstate commerce, tariffs, trade, to deal with pirates, certain universal regulations. If anything, this combined with just internal security against external threats was kind of its main purpose. So I would actually disagree, and I think economics were a core part of why it was even formed. A masculine approach to problem solving, focusing on decisive action. No, the Old Republic was extremely slow in dealing with basically everything. And that's more or less by design, because aside from the only times I think this really happened is it could normally react when there was a Sith Empire to deal with, and there probably was more centralization of power and more of a jingoistic attitude. But I don't really think it's the same thing in an emergency versus peacetime. Once again, very just not the case at all. Encouragement of mass political action, often in the form of a political party or other organization. I mean, I don't even think there wasn't even republic elections. Various member states chose their leadership in various ways. If it was the heir to the throne, if it was elected, appointed a spiritual leader. how would you even participate in the old republic? Once again, the only example I can think of this is when it was faced with existential external threats. Like, I would imagine during the Great Galactic War or the New Sith Wars or the Great Hyperspace War, there was a lot more of like a jingoistic enlist today, buy victory bonds type of thing. But once again, can you really compare an emergency or an existential crisis to the normal operation? Within the normal operation of the state, I would imagine that a general sense of patriotism and love of the republic was encouraged, but I don't really. I guess you had the Commission for the Preservation of the Republic or the Grand Army of the Republic at the very end, but that was after Palpatine had come to power, so I really don't think this applies either. Vanguardism, or the belief in an elite intergroup to safeguard the new order slash revolution. This is debatable. Um, you could argue to a certain extent the Jedi could represent this, as they were kind of to a certain extent um, unconditionally loyal to the New Republic. They protected it. They would deal with corruption if it was really necessary. The Senate in itself, you could argue, is a sort of vanguard that's meant to prevent galaxy wide democracy. Any type of like having referendums or direct rule or anything like that. It is a bit of a stretch, though. You did have an aristocracy in the core worlds that kind of despised or looked down upon the outer systems, but that's just something that naturally forms within most societies. I don't really think you can call that a vanguard. I'm going to give this half a point, though, because I think the Jedi and the Senate, you could argue, are possibly this, but it's kind of a stretch. An often charismatic leader who wields absolute or near absolute power over the state or movement. No, the Chancellor had virtually no powers. These he was Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces pre-Rusin, but afterwards he was just kind of, well, a Chancellor. His job was to mediate between the various factions, probably propose legislation. I'm not sure if the Chancellor had a veto, but I can't even really recall a pre-Rusin Chancellor, let alone some sort of charismatic one. I mean, once you get into Sith empires, they're all over the place. You have Darth Malgus, you have obviously Darth Vitiate, you have Shere Khan from the Brotherhood of Darkness. If you want to talk about the Rule of Two Sith Order, you have Darth Bane. Eventually, you have Palpatine. Then you have uh, Karnor Jax, Thrawn, Paleon, and they're very much more personalist regimes that depend upon the charismatic or um, almost supernatural character. Well, in the case of Star Wars, supernatural characteristics of the leader. Sublimation of the individual and individual interests into the interests of the group, state, or party. Once again, it's very much not the case with the Old Republic. The individual really had nothing to do with it. It was a union of governments that was very vaguely defined. And so this brings us to our final total. And what I got for the Old Republic is a 1.5. Now, I could round this up or I can round this down. I actually can't really determine which way to go with this. I think it's more just a round down, because calling the Jedi like a vanguardist guardian of the revolution is a massive, massive stretch, especially since there were periods of anti-Jedism where the Jedi were looked down upon or almost went extinct and had civil wars and all that kind of stuff. So the Old Republic got 1 point out of 12. So it is in many ways diametrically the exact opposite of the New Order. than being a centralized, masculine, militaristic society that posited a fusion of, I guess you could say, conservative social policies with progressive, industrial, technological, and conceptions of the new men. The Old Republic was a decentralized conservative institution that largely left its various member states alone and let them kind of define their specific governments. Rather than collapsing because it attempted to impose too much order and too much uniformity upon its member states, had quite the opposite problem. The other issue, though, I think you have to keep in mind is the Old Republic didn't collapse because of its own internal contradictions, because of issues with its members. The times it did collapse or near collapse was because of the Brotherhood of Darkness in the new Sith Wars, when Darth Vitiate's Sith Empire, when the Separatists broke out. But keep in mind, the Separatists were being manipulated and controlled by Palpatine and the Sith, which I think you could argue is an external threat. You can correct me, but I don't think, other than maybe some of the Jedi civil wars, there was ever really an internal civil war within the Republic. It was a remarkably stable institution. Now, what might have probably happened if Palpatine hadn't have come along is they might have restored a new republic. Sorry, they might have restored some sort of republic military, slightly centralized things, reformed the administration, and dealt with corruption. Just because a state is having trouble or has issues doesn't mean it's just going to collapse like a sack of bricks. A lot of countries will go through periods of reform and resurgence and periods of decline and issues. The Roman Empire went through this numerous times when the old republic, ironically, the old republic decayed and became the Roman Empire. Then the Roman Empire decayed, and then you had the Dominate, then you had civil wars, then Constantine, and eventually you got the Byzantine Empire, which was a much more functional state compared to the late Roman Empire. So this happens all the time. America's gone through periods of disintegration and resurgence. Britain has. Just because one, like I said, a country is having troubles or is in dire need of major reforms doesn't mean it can't reform itself. The fact that the Old Republic lasted tens of thousands of years without collapsing from internal pressure, I think indicates once again that you might have had the reinstatement of a formal army to deal with pirates and interstate conflict, and a recognition that the judicial forces were completely insufficient for this task. But on the whole, it can't really in meaningfully sense be defined as being fascist. It's a classical liberal and conservative institution that bears, I think, the most resemblance of something in the real world to, I don't know, like the Commonwealth of Nations maybe, or I think early pre-constitutional America is probably the closest thing to it. And sort of represents more sort of like Tolkien's idealized version of society rather than anything that Hitler or Mussolini would have come up with. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it interesting. It is kind of cool that I got one that had basically 1 point versus 12 points, because comparisons are interesting, and it's really through comparisons I think that we often learn the most. So God bless everybody. I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you guys again real soon.